RAM speed is one of the most misunderstood specs in a PC. Numbers like 2400, 3200, 3600, or 6000 MHz look simple, but they don't tell the full story. Faster doesn't always mean better, and in many cases it barely matters at all. In this video, we're breaking down every RAM speed, what those numbers actually mean, when they help performance, and when they're just marketing. By the end, you'll know exactly which RAM speed makes sense for your system, and which ones are a waste of money. When you see a RAM speed like 3200 MHz, that number is not the true clock speed. Modern DDR memory transfers data twice per clock cycle, which is why it's called double data rate. So a kit advertised as 3200 MHz is actually running at a real clock of 1600 MHz, but moving data twice per cycle. What RAM speed really represents is how quickly data can be moved between memory and the CPU. Higher speeds mean more data can be transferred per second, increasing bandwidth. But speed alone doesn't determine performance. RAM is part of a larger system. If the CPU isn't waiting on memory, higher speeds won't help. This is why some upgrades feel dramatic, and others feel pointless. Understanding how RAM speeds evolved puts current numbers into perspective. DDR1 launched in 2000 with speeds ranging from 200 to 400 MHz. Maximum bandwidth was around 3.2 GB per second. For context, that's slower than a modern SATA solid-state drive. DDR2 arrived in 2003, doubling performance potential. Speeds ranged from 400 to 1066 MHz at lower voltage. Bandwidth jumped to about 8.5 GB per second. The prefetch buffer improved, fetching 4 bits per clock cycle instead of 2. DDR3 came in 2007 and became the longest-lasting standard. Speeds ranged from 800 to 2133 MHz officially, though enthusiast overclocking pushed higher. Maximum bandwidth reached 17 GB per second. DDR3 dominated for nearly a decade because it offered the perfect balance of performance, compatibility, and cost. DDR4 launched in 2014, and at first it didn't feel urgent. DDR3 was still fast enough, but DDR4's architecture allowed much higher ceilings. Official speeds started at 2133 MHz and scaled to 3200 MHz and beyond. Maximum bandwidth at stock speeds reached 25.6 GB per second. The introduction of bank groups allowed memory to handle multiple operations in parallel. This is where DDR4 truly separated itself. DDR5 arrived in 2021, designed not to solve yesterday's problems, but to prepare for tomorrow's workloads. Base speeds began at 4800 MHz, already higher than most DDR4 kits. DDR5 splits each module into 2 independent sub-channels, allowing simultaneous data access. Maximum bandwidth at 6400 MHz hits 51.2 GB per second, double that of DDR4. Each generation roughly doubled the speed of its predecessor, but the improvements weren't just about megahertz. Power efficiency improved dramatically across every transition. Out of the box, RAM almost never runs at its advertised speed. That's because every memory kit follows GDEC standards, which are conservative, safe baseline speeds designed for maximum compatibility and stability. For DDR4, those base speeds are typically 2133 or 2400 MHz. For DDR5, it's usually 4800 MHz. Motherboards default to these speeds to avoid instability. Running higher speeds requires enabling memory profiles, which we'll get to shortly. This is why many people unknowingly run expensive RAM at slow speeds for years without realizing it. The GDEC organization sets these standards to ensure any DDR module will work in any compatible motherboard without manual configuration. Motherboard manufacturers have no way of knowing what RAM will be installed, so they default to the lowest common denominator. This conservative approach ensures stability, but it also means millions of users are leaving performance on the table. The performance difference between 2400 MHz and 3600 MHz in DDR4 can be substantial, 10 to 20% improvements in CPU-bound scenarios. When RAM is sold as 3200 MHz or 6000 MHz, that speed is not guaranteed by default. Those numbers represent tested overclock profiles, not stock operation. Your CPU, motherboard, and memory controller all need to support that speed. If one component can't handle it, the system will either fall back to a lower speed or become unstable. This is why RAM compatibility lists exist, and why buying extremely fast memory doesn't automatically mean better performance. The memory controller built into the CPU has limits. Intel's 12th and 13th generation processors officially support DDR5 up to 5600 MHz. AMD's Ryzen 7000 series officially supports up to 5200 MHz. Pushing beyond these limits enters overclocking territory where stability isn't guaranteed. The motherboard also plays a crucial role. A high-end board with superior power delivery can handle faster speeds more reliably than budget alternatives. Temperature matters too. RAM generates heat at high speeds and voltages. Poor case airflow can lead to thermal throttling, especially with DDR5, which runs hotter than DDR4. To reach advertised speeds, RAM relies on XMP for Intel or EXPO for AMD. These are pre-configured settings stored on the RAM that tell the motherboard what frequency, voltage, and timings to use. When you enable XMP or EXPO in the BIOS, you're technically overclocking the memory, just in a controlled, manufacturer-tested way. Without this step, even the fastest RAM will run at slow base speeds. The process is straightforward. Restart the computer and enter the BIOS during boot, usually by pressing Delete, F2, or F12. Navigate to the overclocking or memory settings section. Enable XMP or EXPO, save changes, and exit. The system restarts with RAMs now running at its advertised speed. These profiles don't just change frequency, they adjust timings, voltage, and sometimes CPU-related settings. A typical XMP profile might set voltage to 1.35 volts instead of the GDEC standard 1.2 volts for DDR4. Sometimes enabling XMP or EXPO doesn't work on the first try. The system might fail to boot or experience instability. This doesn't necessarily mean defective RAM. It might mean the motherboard BIOS needs updating or the CPU's memory controller can't quite handle that speed. Manual adjustment of voltage or timings may be required. Here's where most people get it wrong. RAM speed and RAM latency work together. A higher megahertz kit with poor latency can perform the same or worse than a slower kit with tighter timings. Latency is measured in CAS latency, or CL. Lower CL means the RAM responds faster to requests. The real performance comes from balance, not raw megahertz. This is why 3600 MHz CL16 often outperforms 4000 MHz CL22. KS latency represents the number of clock cycles required for RAM to respond to a request. To calculate true latency in nanoseconds, the formula is CL divided by frequency multiplied by 2000. A 3200 MHz CL16 kit has an absolute latency of 10 nanoseconds. A 3600 MHz CL18 kit also has 10 nanoseconds. Despite different specifications on paper, they perform nearly identically. This relationship becomes critical with DDR5. Early DDR5 kits ran at 4800 MHz with CL40 timings, significantly worse latency than quality DDR4 kits. Modern DDR5 at 6000 MHz CL30 achieves approximately 10 nanoseconds, finally matching DDR4 performance. As DDR5 continues maturing, kits are reaching 6400 MHz CL32 or 7200 MHz CL34, pushing latency closer to 9 nanoseconds. The balance between frequency and latency explains why experienced builders often choose what appears to be slower RAM based on specifications alone. DDR4 and DDR5 speeds cannot be compared directly. DDR5 uses dual sub-channels, which improves parallelism, meaning it can handle data more efficiently even with higher latency. This is why DDR5 needs higher megahertz numbers to show meaningful gains. Early DDR5 at 4800 MHz didn't feel much faster than DDR4 3600 MHz, because the latency was worse. Now, with DDR5 hitting 6,000 to 7,200 MHz with decent timings, the gap is real. DDR5 implements on-die error correction, improving reliability. It also moves voltage regulation from the motherboard to the RAM module itself, allowing better power efficiency. The dual-channel architecture splits a single 64-bit channel into two independent 32-bit channels. This allows simultaneous data access where previous generations handled tasks sequentially. DDR5 pricing has dropped substantially since launch. Quality 32GB. DDR5 6000 kits now cost about the same as premium DDR4 3600 kits. For new system builds, DDR5 makes sense. For upgrading existing DDR4 systems, the gains rarely justify replacing the entire platform. In gaming, RAM speed mostly affects CPU-bound scenarios, strategy games, simulations, esports titles, and open-world games. In GPU-bound games, faster RAM barely changes frame rates. At 1080p resolution with a powerful graphics card, the GPU finishes rendering frames quickly, making the CPU the limiting factor. Faster RAM reduces the time the CPU spends waiting for data. At 4K resolution, each frame takes the GPU much longer to render. The CPU completes its work and waits. During this waiting period, RAM speed becomes irrelevant. Certain games are more memory-sensitive. Flight simulators, city builders, grand strategy titles, and competitive shooters played at high frame rates all benefit from faster RAM. For productivity tasks like video editing, compression, or compiling code, RAM speed helps, but only up to a point. Video editing sees moderate gains, especially when scrubbing through timelines or applying real-time effects. Three-dimensional rendering benefits during scene construction but often shifts to GPU rendering where RAM speed matters less. Code compilation can see significant speedups because compilers constantly access memory. Once the CPU stops waiting on memory, gains flatten quickly. For DDR4, the sweet spot is 3,200 to 3,600 MHz, depending on latency and CPU. For DDR5, the sweet spot today is 5,600 to 6,000 MHz on most modern platforms. Beyond this, price rises faster than performance. The price-to-performance curve for RAM is steep at both extremes. Moving from slow-budget RAM to the sweet spot provides substantial gains. Moving from the sweet spot to extreme enthusiast, RAM provides almost nothing. A 6,000 MHz DDR5 kit costs around $120. An 8,000 MHz kit costs around $400. The performance difference is typically 2 to 3%. When shopping for RAM, capacity should be the first priority. For most users, 16 GB is ideal. For heavier multitasking or content creation, 32 GB is the practical ceiling. Beyond that, gains depend entirely on specific workloads. Then, consider speed within the sweet spot range. Then latency. Then aesthetics like RGB lighting. Brand matters less than most people think. What matters is buying from reputable manufacturers with good warranties and modules listed on motherboard compatibility lists. Faster RAM does not always increase frame rates. It only helps when the CPU is memory-bound. Otherwise, there's zero difference. More megahertz does not guarantee better performance. Latency matters just as much. Balance wins. Mixing RAM speeds works, but everything runs at the slowest speed. This is not recommended. Another common misconception is that RAM speed doesn't matter at all. This is false. RAM speed matters in specific scenarios, just not universally. Some believe RAM kits must be matched exactly from the same manufacturing batch. Modern motherboards are surprisingly capable of running mismatched kits as long as basic specifications are compatible. There's also a myth that RGB RAM performs worse because lighting components take up cooling space. This is incorrect. The performance difference between RGB and non-RGB kits with identical specifications is effectively zero. RAM speed matters, but only when your system is actually waiting on memory. Once you understand how speed, latency, and compatibility work together, choosing RAM stops being confusing. It becomes a practical decision instead of a guessing game. Buy balanced memory. enable the right profiles, and don't chase numbers your system can't use. That's how RAM speed actually works.